A former White House employee said that Putin is significantly richer than he is. This former employee is Elon Musk, who occasionally says something sensible, because staying sensible while running X.com is also a challenge. But how rich is Putin exactly? We all know Vladimir Putin has a strong desire for land. During a geography awards ceremony in 2016, a 9-year-old boy said that Russian border ended at Bering Strait. Putin corrected the boy and said that Russia's borders are basically limitless.
Граница России нигде не заканчивается.
He has also promised to protect ethnic Russians no matter where they are located. Yes, teaching imperialism while they are young is what Putin is all about. So how does Russia fund its imperial ambitions? Let's go into it. To answer this question, we need to look at Russia's National Wealth Fund, or Putin's piggy bank, which is like a prominent Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, but for wars and geopolitical destabilization. The fund was created in 2008 as a result of a split of the Stabilization Fund into two separate funds, the National Wealth Fund and the Reserve Fund. In 2017, the Reserve Fund was nullified and only the Wealth Fund was left. The National Welfare Fund has two main goals: to help cover any gaps in the federal budget and the pension fund of Russia, and to support citizens' voluntary pension savings. The fund is built using money made from managing it and extra income from oil and gas sales as directed by the Russian government. The federal budget's oil and gas income comes from taxes on extracting oil, natural gas and gas condensate, export duties on crude oil, export duties on natural gas, export duties on production made from oil. The extra income comes from selling oil at prices higher than what is expected in the budget. This extra money helps to grow the National Welfare Fund. The difference in price happens when the actual price of oil is higher than what was planned in the budget for the year ahead. Putin launched a wealth fund to make Russians rich and to fund the geopolitical ambitions. So far, it's nailing one of those, and spoiler, it's not making any Russians rich. But is the National Wealth Fund in Russia in crisis? War is expensive, and for Russia it is especially costly due to corruption. Putin's ongoing war in Ukraine is damaging Russia's wealth. It is gradually depleting Russia's sovereign wealth fund and causing rising inflation. As reported by Bloomberg in January 2025, the liquid part of the Russian sovereign wealth fund, the cash and the investments that can be easily accessed, fell by 24% in 2024, so 1/4 in 1 year. By January 1st, 2025, it had shrunk to 3.8 trillion rubles, or about $47.1 billion. Bloomberg also pointed out that this fund, which normally comes from energy revenues, had decreased by 57% since before the invasion. So, to make it into a simple tongue, over half of it is burned through. You know, when you have a massive amount of savings, but half of it is gone already because of your spending spree, you begin to feel a little shaky. Before the invasion, the fund was 8.9 trillion rubles, or about $97.8 billion. For 2025, Russia plans to spend 17 trillion rubles, about $177 billion on defense and nation security. This amount makes up about 41% of its overall budget. The Russian finance ministry noted that this fiscal deficit jumped from 124 billion rubles, which is $1.3 billion in January 24, to 1.7 trillion rubles, or about $18.6 billion in January 25. So that's the amount that they're spending more than they are earning, or that was planned into their budget. Now there's gonna be a massive amount of trillions and billions and rubles and dollars in this video, but we'll get through it. For the sake of the truth, we'll get through it. If spending continues to rise while the sovereign wealth fund shrinks, Russia will struggle to handle future economic challenges, whether linked to the war in Ukraine or not. And when I say challenges, I mean their pensioners might not get their pensions in the years to come, and that will make them angry. You don't want to make Russian pensioners angry. By January 25, Russia had a current account deficit of $700 million, down from a surplus of $2.9 billion in January 24. So, It was a massive surplus because the oil and gas revenues, and now suddenly it's a deficit. So it goes like this. Making up Russian budget, man, it must be impossible. You don't know what comes in, what goes out, because there's so much corruption and the oil and gas prices fluctuate so much. Some economists predict that Russia's liquid reserves might run out in the fall of 2025 if current trends continue. Putin's spending billions on war in Ukraine is like a shopping spree. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians are stuck window shopping for bread. And it's not a joke here, because 20 million Russians live below the poverty line. And not the poverty line in the US or in the EU, the poverty line in Russia. I mean, Russia's poverty line is on another level compared to the Western world. By the way, do you want to see a magic trick? This would blow your mind. Remember, after Putin started the war against Ukraine, Russian propaganda boasted about Russia's GDP growth? It's an economic trick, just to show how Putin's Russia is. In reality, the GDP growth of over 4% in 23 and 24 is not backed up by any real economic growth. The swift growth of government expenditure, encompassing both direct budget allocations and state-supported lending programs, has been the central engine behind Russia's recent economic developments. Between 22 and 24, the fiscal stimulus exceeded 10% of GDP, with preferential loan totals in the banking sector surpassing 15 trillion rubles, or about $150 billion. This remarkable spending has transformed the military-industrial sector into the key driver of economic growth. However, signs of strain are becoming apparent. By the third quarter of 24, the GDP growth rate had decelerated to 3.1% compared to 4.1% in the prior quarter. While industries associated with defense production continue to expand, their growth rate is significantly lower than last year's. Other sectors are struggling. Extractive industries are experiencing decreased production due to falling hydrocarbon export prices and OPEC plus output reductions, while agriculture is also losing steam. Retail trade remains a notable exception, supported by consumer spending. Where do these consumers get the money to spend? Well, I'll tell you, all of these women who go on shopping sprees because they got that one-time payment for their meat of a husband who was just demilitarized in Ukraine, they got that payment and now they can shop. Wow, wow, wee-wah, ooh la la. Yet the surveys indicate a decline in business activity and rising inflation expectations among businesses and households. So yeah, Russia's saying its economy is strong, if by strong you mean is held together with tank parts and you hope no one checks the receipts. The constraints of Russia's production capabilities are clear. Industrial plants are functioning at 81% of their capacity, and 73% of enterprises are facing labor shortages. Unemployment has reached a record low of 2.3%, leaving around 1.6 million positions unfilled. Essentially, the domestic economy is unable to satisfy the demand generated by vigorous state and household expenditure, leading to a greater dependence on imports. This situation increases the need for foreign currency, which exerts downward pressure on the ruble and contributes to inflation. As always, watch what Russia does, not what it says. You know Russia desperately needs money. Just look who Putin sent to negotiate with the Americans. Putin sent his money guy, Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. But Putin will never admit it. In fact, recently, he told business leaders at Kremlin meeting that Western tech companies still operating in Russia but acting against the country's interest should be strangled, implying that Russia will strangle the West. It's funny because Putin says Russia doesn't need foreign money. He's just out there selling gold, gas and grandma silverware for fun. But in all seriousness, do you know who strangles who, really? Western sanctions are strangling the Russian economy. They are slower than we would like, but my God, they do. How? Russia's budget for the year 2025 was meticulously designed based on an anticipated average price of $70 per barrel for Ural's crude oil, alongside an exchange rate of 96.5 rubles to the US dollar. This estimation projects substantial oil and gas revenues totaling approximately 11 trillion rubles. Out of this figure, around 1.8 trillion rubles is earmarked as supplementary income intended for the National Welfare Fund, which means they planned that they're gonna put almost 2 trillion rubles extra to the National Welfare Fund in 2025. That's a nice plan, Ivan. The fund itself plays a critical role in bolstering the country's financial stability and funding various social programs. Also, the pensions. You don't want to make the Russian pensioners angry, I'm telling you. But Putin is taking their money right now. However, the current market dynamics present a stark contrast to these Russian budget projections. Analysts predict a significant revenue shortfall of approximately 2 trillion rubles, the exact same amount that they wanted to put extra to the National Welfare Fund. Oh no, so sad. This deficit raises serious concerns about the ability to replenish the National Welfare Fund. I mean, let's be honest, it's gonna run dry, potentially leaving it vulnerable and without the necessary resources to support future economic endeavors and social welfare initiatives. It's important to consider the broader picture. While the West has taken steps to limit Russia's ability to fund its war by imposing sanctions, it has also paradoxically enabled Russia to accumulate significant revenue. Following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Western allies introduced sanctions on Russian energy exports. The US and the UK banned Russian oil and gas, and the EU prohibited imports of Russian seaborne crude oil, but gas imports were not fully restricted. Despite these measures, by May 29th, Russia had earned over 883 billion euros or $973 billion from fossil fuel exports since the invasion began. According to the Center for Research of Energy and Clean Air, notably 228 billion euros of that came from countries that had imposed sanctions. 210 billion from the EU member states alone. EU countries continued purchasing Russian pipeline gas until Ukraine halted the transit in January 2025. Meanwhile, Russian crude oil is still being delivered via pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia. Gas exports to Europe via Turkey have grown significantly, with a 26.7% increase in volume in early 25. Compared to the same period in 24. Hungary and Slovakia also continue receiving Russian gas through Turkey. The EU strategy to cripple Putin's economy is genius. Hit him with sanctions, then fund his recovery by buying his gas. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline you bought from the arsonists.
Can't fight fire with water. You gotta fight fire with fire.
It's ridiculous. Moreover, with Western sanctions, Russia's fossil fuel revenues in 24 dropped by only 5% compared to 23, with export volumes declining by just 6%, according to Rehi. At the same time, Russia saw a 6% increase in crude oil export revenues and 9% year-on-year rise in pipeline gas income. Russian data suggests that gas exports to Europe increased by up to 20% in 24, with liquefied natural gas exports hitting a record high, half of which now go to the EU, according to Rehi. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas has acknowledged that the bloc has not enacted the toughest possible sanctions on Russian energy. This is why we need more sanctions on Russia now. At least EU politicians are sobering up to the issue. In general, Russia has significantly increased its projected 2025 budget deficit, tripling it from 1.17 trillion rubles or $14.8 billion to 3.8 trillion rubles or $48.3 billion. I remind these are the amounts that are the deficit, so that the amount that they are lacking from the planned budget, 48.3 billion. For US, it's nothing, but for Russians, it's deadly. This sharp rise from 0.5% to 1.7% deficit of GDP was prompted by plunging global oil prices and stronger ruble, which together are expected to reduce oil and gas revenues by 2.6 trillion rubles or $33 billion. By the way, such a weird paradox, but the stronger the ruble is, the less money Russia gets from oil and gas revenues, because when you sell oil and gas, there will be transactions and conversions of ruble to euro or ruble to dollars, and when ruble is super strong, you get less rubles. It's so weird. Russia's revised oil forecast now prices Urals crude at $56 per barrel, down from the original 69.70. In reality, some Russian crude blends have dropped as low as $48.9 per barrel, the lowest in 2 years and well below the $82.6 initially used in the budget calculations. See, they made their plans for 2025 calculating that $1 of their crude cost $82, but now it's close to 50, even 49 at some specific blends, so it's a 50% drop from what they planned. This is massive. According to Vladislav Vlasyuk, Ukraine's commissioner for sanctions policy, international sanctions are a key factor behind Russia's financial troubles. He urged even tougher measures, especially targeting Russia's shadow oil fleet, which remains partly operational despite existing sanctions. He also called for sanctions on Russian ports, terminals, and even individual ship captains. Meanwhile, oil prices fell further after US President Donald Trump announced new tariffs on April 7th, sparking fears of global recession. Trump claimed falling oil prices were pressuring Russia to consider peace talks. Mr. Trump, nobody wants your peace talks. What? Get out of them, peace. Get out of here. Despite mounting pressure, the US recently blocked a G7 effort to lower the $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil. I mean, I'll say that again, this is insane. I mean, if Trump wants Putin on the table on his terms, he has to pressure Putin. But the US vetoed lowering the price cap. So the US saved Russia from being forced to sell its crude oil even cheaper. What is going on? While most G7 members supported the move, the US Treasury withheld approval, preventing tighter restrictions that Ukraine had strongly supported. Thanks, orange geopolitical genius. Remember, I started the video with Elon Musk's statement about Putin being richer. Musk and his former boss, Orange Megatron peacemaker in 24 hours Donald Trump, started this Putin wants peace nonsense. But every step of the way, Putin demonstrated that he does not want peace. Countless numbers of bombing Ukrainian civilians. Russia's federal budget reflects Putin's desire to continue the war. Because the war machine is the #1 priority in this budget. Russia's military spending is surging at an astonishing rate, dwarfing the combined military budget of all European nations. Regardless of their concentrated efforts to increase defense funding and modernize their forces. According to the latest military balance report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the forecast for Russia's military expenditure last year reached an eye-popping 13.1 trillion rubles or $145.9 billion. This figure represents a striking 6.7% of the nation's GDP, showcasing a staggering increase of over 40% compared to the previous year. By the way, Poland and Estonia in NATO are the top spenders according to GDP. Poland is already over 5% and Estonia will be just under 5% of GDP going to military expenditure at the end of 2025. I say every NATO member needs to be at 5% at the current geopolitical situation in the world. Not 2, 5. Putin says he wants peace, but his defense budget says he's just shopping for it at the ammunition aisle. In contrast, Europe's total defense spending for 2024 is projected to be around $457 billion, reflecting more than a 50% increase in nominal terms since 2014. Moreover, when adjusted for inflation, this figure is 11.7% higher than the previous year, indicating a significant but still inadequate response to the escalating threat landscape. As military budgets across the continent rise, the scale of Russia's expenditure casts a long shadow, highlighting a growing imbalance in military capabilities within Europe. On November 21st, the State Duma approved the federal budget for 2025 and set plans for budget for 26 and 27. Spending will continue to increase for another year, mainly due to a rise in national defense and internal security costs. Together, these areas will make up more than 43% of the budget, with military funding also hidden in other budget sections. The ongoing war will increasingly depend on funding from businesses and citizens as the Kremlin plans to raise taxes while cutting spending on social welfare and human capital. I'm talking about the pensions again. The pensioners, Putin is coming for you. The 2025 budget shows that Kremlin is committed to waging war despite the rising costs and economic difficulties. Last year, the Russian government expected to spend most on military in 2024, believing that war costs would decrease in later years, but oh, how wrong they were. They thought Ukraine's defenses would fall and military operations would ease. However, this hopeful scenario has not happened, leading to further pressure on the national economy and citizens. Despite these challenges, Putin seems to believe that the West will stop supporting Ukraine before Russia runs out of money. Although military spending has increased, Putin isn't shy when it comes to cutting the civilian budget. When introducing the 2025 budget, Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin emphasized that the government would fully meet its social obligations to citizens. This claim holds up if one overlooks how the government has quietly reduced the number of people eligible for these benefits. Overall spending on social policy is set to fall by over 15%, dropping from 7.7 trillion rubles to 6.5 trillion. Given the ruble's continuing depreciation nearing 100 rubles per US dollar, this equates to a decrease in dollar terms from roughly $77 billion to $65 billion. That's a massive drop for civilian expenditure. I'm talking about the pensions again. Russian pensioners, it's time for you to rise up. You know how usually the revolts and revolutions start from students. But no, in Russia, in this time, they have to start from the pensioners. This significant reduction stems largely from the unpopular 2018 pension reform, which raised their retirement age. The Russian pension fund has long operated at a deficit, as contributions from employers fail to cover the full costs of pension payouts. The shortfall has traditionally been filled by federal budget transfers, but in 2025, this subsidy will be cut by 25%, about 1 trillion rubles compared to previous year. Russia's budget priorities are clear. Why fund schools and hospitals when you can buy more tanks? There is no doubt that the Russian economy is facing challenges. Putin allocates more funds for the war while reducing civilian expenditures and drawing more from the National Wealth Fund. The economy of Russia is no longer experiencing overheating. The growth that Vladimir Putin constantly boasts about is starting to slow down. This situation will likely be difficult for some Russians, particularly the over 20 million living in poverty. But it is expected that the military initiative will remain unaffected. However, this does not imply that the regime can afford to be complacent. There are still numerous potential pitfalls. At the same time, a drop in imports, aspirations for a ceasefire, and the potential relaxation of sanctions, combined with a weakening US dollar, have resulted in the ruble's appreciation. Some experts predict that the Russian economy could face economic collapse by the end of 2025, but only time will show whether the predictions are true. Regardless, we all know that only economic pressure on Russia is not enough, and that military aid to Ukraine is the key to the destruction of Putin's geopolitical expansion. Thank you for being here for so long, and if you are here right now, subscribe to the channel and become a channel member. If you already are, then you saw this video as an early access. You got early access to it a week before everybody else. If you didn't, if you're seeing it late, then you have to become a member. It's only $1 a month. Until my next video, my friends, Slava Ukraini, and bye-bye.